Yes, thank you. So, welcome, bonjour, because we are in a bilingual country here. This is the menu of our semi-plenary. And welcome in this kind of plateaus cave, because it's a bit dark here. I hope it will not be only a myth. So this is the problematic of this conference, this exchange, conversation, fair ecological transition from hybrid mini-publics to a responsive deliberative system. Deliberative ecological transitions with an S and adaptation are explored in 3 cases in this session: the production of academic knowledge and not academic knowledge too, decision support for decision makers of varied authority, and for citizens performing pluralist assemblies assisted by experts from several disciplines. The panel will contribute from different perspectives on deliberation as a creative rhetorical resource for complex and multi-level democracies. And rhetoric is a very positive and important terminology and term. So regarding the conveners, okay, it's this computer. This is part of a project from the Earth System Center, Earth Politics Center, sorry, from Universities Paris-Cité with Sciences Po. And in Sciences Po, as in many places, we have networks of interdisciplinary workshop on environmental research. And to make a kind of a clin d'oeil, it's not the problem to make our planet great again, if you remember the Macron and former Donald Trump, but it's to think to make our planet great again. And the title of this Responsiveness project, the project between Sciences Po and Paris-Cité, University Paris-Cité, is Knowledge Responsiveness for Fair Ecological Transition, Citizens Convention, Assemblies and Conferences for the Climate. So part of the project is case studies, and another part is to convene all the disciplines around this issue. I'm a Swiss-French guy. It's a kind of oxymoron, a political oxymoron, and I feel very comfortable in this place with Oise, because Oise is the department I live in France, for the people who know France. I'm a moral and political philosopher. I work around questions around deliberative democracy, deliberative system, the problem of different pluralism to confront, moral, political, and epistemic one, the problem of responsibilities, and then the different interconnected responsibilities, and of course, weaknesses in this theory, promises too. But I've been for around 30 years a kind of embedded philosophers in different mini-publics, starting with the Citizen Conference on GM food. And these last 2 years in France, as you know, we had the famous great national debate. It was very huge, 10,000 local debates in 1.5 months, 2 million proposals on a platform. It's much more than the Conference for the Future of Europe. It was another case studies. And in between, we have the French Citizen Convention for the Climate. And I will say a couple of words on this, but we will not have time with the details. So we have tried with my 3 colleagues. We have already 3 conferences, so we have a lot of time behind to make our our exchange very, if it's possible, responsive or very interactive. This is the plan, and as you know, to improvise well, you need provisions. So general introduction is almost finished. First, science for decision from different levels with different perspectives. And there we will have a first round with our colleague. And after that, we'll tackle the question of address, at least, responsive governance, pluralisms and controversy, a second round with brief interaction. And after that, we will open the floor with you, with normally the questions, critiques, argumented critiques only. And we will have time for answers. And after that, it's a bit new, we will grasp all the proposals you have to answer to the same questions. And since we have only one mic, you will come here to address your question. And please, no more than 1 minute. If you use 1 minute, we will have time for 4 questions, and after that, 4 questions and 18 proposals. And after that, you will have the response of the speakers, the reaction comments, and 10 minutes before the end, we will have to reflect a bit about the priorities for ESG community and for the people who are dealing with these questions. The challenge is to interdisciplinary tackle this question and not a kind of a juxtaposition. So this is the plan. And we will start with the 4 first questions towards responsive multilateral governance, different ways to be accountable, combining sciences and decision-making. And we will take every level, and we will try, and it will be very difficult for you because we will have to do that in 5 minutes only, how science with the different disciplines is being fed into decision-making at each level. The second question, how transparent and accountable are these sciences for decision processes? And what are the responsibilities for the level for decision-making you are focused on in terms of doing something with the scientific input? And the last question, how responsive is the level chosen to other levels to make the transition fair? So you will have the opportunity to answer to this question. So we will start now with James. James, you are on the first level. Our societies, with the fake news, with the complexities, reductionism, with the conflicts, with the partial, the wrong beliefs, among others. And how is it possible? It will be a very Frenchy question. How is it possible to accelerate the ecological transition with a yellow vest crisis? And it was a French case, but you can have that in many other countries. So James, you are an interdisciplinary social scientist coming from civil engineering. It's me that now you are civilized. Assistant professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, but coming from Australia. Your work focuses on the politics of domestic climate change policy, and you are currently leading a European Research Council project. Congratulations. Climate backlash, contentious reactions to policy action. Please, James.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And you've certainly looked up my past. I was indeed originally an engineer, although I don't remember anything from that time. So I comfortably call myself an interdisciplinary social scientist now, that's for sure.
Take mine.
Sorry, the light is on, but...
Oh, it's okay.
Okay, maybe I was doing something wrong. So in this session, we're looking at the conditions for just ecological transitions, especially considering issues of context, knowledge, norms. And in terms of levels, as Bernard said, I'm sort of working at the domestic politics level. So my approach to this topic is perhaps a bit in reverse, in the sense of looking at where efforts to bring about transition go wrong, specifically looking at backlash to policy, and then trying to understand the nature of these reactions and ultimately how they can be avoided. So when it comes to knowledge inputs into decision-making, I actually start from the next step along from decision-making, looking at reactions to policies, and try to use that as a window into the social political dynamics involved in action for transformation. And the reason I think this is valuable is because it draws attention to the relations between policy and society, which seem to be becoming more volatile and contentious in contemporary times, especially regarding climate change, but also many other issues. Of course, we see volatility regarding issues like right-wing populism, misinformation, and even just widely varying interpretations of what ecological transitions mean for different people. But nonetheless, I would not want to assume that anyone who reacts against climate policy, even if it does involve backlash, is necessarily recalcitrant. Of course, policy action can have different impacts on different people. If impacts disproportionately fall on those who are already socially or economically marginalized, or workers and communities fear losing their livelihoods and social identities, then it might not be fair to view pushback as only recalcitrant. I would argue that genuine policy backlash is probably going to be more cross-cutting, involving a range of different actors and political positions, which is probably constitutively why it is a powerful force. So some examples of backlash might be acrimonious policy repeal in Australia in 2014, the Yellow Vests movement in France in 2018-19, and constitutional challenges to national climate policy from several provinces here in Canada in 2019-2021. While there'll be certainly will be aspects of populism in these cases in various ways, I think to reduce them purely to populism might be a bit premature. For me, a key question then becomes, what is the appropriate political response to backlash in the context of ecological transition? And can deliberative processes such as mini-publics be a solution? Deliberation is increasingly seen as helpful in responding to the challenges of policymaking on difficult issues in difficult social contexts, including social polarization. And of course, deliberation has been used in a range of settings, as Bernard mentioned, such as in France to inform climate policy making following the Yellow Vests. But backlash is a complicated issue which might not be easily amenable to deliberation. Therefore, I would argue that we should examine mini-publics as a technology of governance and ask, under what conditions might they be a solution to backlash, rather than assuming a priori that they're either useful or not. If we view politics as a constant struggle over ideas, as well as over material interests, and something that's never entirely rational, but also involving narratives of right and wrong, emotions, power, then it might be unrealistic to expect that mini-publics will be able to neutralize fierce discontent. For example, grievances about the role of elites in society, economic inequalities, cultural values and recognition, and concerns about the future are hard to tame. Perhaps these kinds of factors can be channeled productively when a particular group of people deliberate, but their reasoning would also then need to diffuse and be accepted throughout the political community. Political parties might try to undermine a deliberative process for their own advantage. And of course, governments would need to genuinely use the conclusions of a mini-public in a meaningful way, which they often seem to be resistant to doing. So in conclusion, I would argue that we need to study the interaction between policy and society within ecological transitions in ways that acknowledge the potential for volatility and profound conflict. And we should be cautious about assuming that good science, good reasoning, and good procedures will be enough by themselves. Perhaps responsive governance might require something more messy and evolving.
Thank you, James. We see the engineer behind because it's perfect. Now we have more time. We move from the general public the resistance to global governance with Arti Gupta. Arti, you are professor of global environmental governance with the Environmental Policy Group Department of Social Sciences in Wageningen University, Netherlands. You have been trained in political sciences, international relations, and science and technology and society. Your research is in the field of global environmental and climate governance with a focus on transparency and accountability and the challenges of anticipatory governance of novel technologies such as climate engineering. Please, Arti.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Is this a good volume? Can everyone hear me well? Okay, great. Thank you, Bernard, for inviting me to be part of this important discussion, how responsive governance originating from different sites and sources of authority can help to realize a just ecological transition. This raises the immediate question of contestations around what a just ecological transition even means and how to realize it, and the diverse forms of interdisciplinary knowledge required to realize diverse visions of a just transition. You are interested in the role of science in this at different levels of decision making, and I'm meant to say something about this at for the global level. It's indeed a tall order to say something meaningful about this in 5 minutes, so I thought what I would do is just offer 3 simple first order fundamental propositions that have underpinned my work on the role of science in global environmental governance in the last decade or so. And I must leave out nuance and detail, which is of course a challenging thing for us, but so it is. And just to preface my remarks a bit, I've been particularly interested in the role of science in newly emerging anticipatory areas of global governance, by which I mean areas where the very existence and nature of the problem to be governed remains both scientifically uncertain and normatively contested, but where one still needs to devise governance arrangements in the present, yet to steer towards contested futures. For example, anticipatory governance of novel technologies like modern biotechnology or climate engineering. So the challenge here is, how do we devise effective and just governance in the present to steer towards what are fundamentally contested futures, and whose visions of desired futures count? And what is the role then for different types of knowledges and expertise in this? So let me offer my 3 propositions, speaking to the last part of this research challenge. First, I started my academic career coincidentally by examining the role of organized global scientific assessment processes in international environmental decision-making arenas with a group of others from different disciplinary perspectives and ontological commitments. There were many heated debates here, but a key collective insight emanating from this global environmental assessment, GEA project, was that a science that's perceived as credible, that is good, legitimate, inclusive, meaning inclusive, and salient, meaning relevant, was most likely to be taken up in political and decision-making processes. So this was sort of seen as a definitive statement. Credible, legitimate, and relevant science is what matters. For me, this raised some crucial follow-up questions. Were there trade-offs between these 3? Was the one a precondition to the other? And my own conclusion at the time was that a perception of legitimacy was paramount. In fact, it was a precondition for the other 2, that a science perceived as legitimate would also then be perceived as credible and salient. This was not necessarily received wisdom at the time, but it pointed to the crucial role of political considerations such as equity, access, and voice in making science matter for decision-making. So second, and following up on this, a somewhat controversial position I took early on in the much debated science-politics interface was that a politically negotiated science was likely to be most influential in shaping decision-making, rather than an expert-driven consensual science based on objectivity. This raised some eyebrows because how could science be negotiated? My point was and has been that scientific conflicts addressed via deliberate ambiguity and negotiated creative language is the kind of science likely to be agreed upon by all in contested decision-making arenas. And finally, so this was the second insight. Politically negotiated science is influential. So if we want influential science, we must embrace its political nature. And finally, third point was related to this, that a key hurdle facing a fair ecological transition is not a politicization of science, as many lament, but it's rather the opposite, the technicalization of politics. This is an awkward term, I know, and my spell check program hates it, but I find it a compelling way to capture the worry I have that key aspects of issues subject to political normative conflict are increasingly transferred to the expert domain to be dealt with as if they are technical questions. So this is the third insight then, that a technicalization of politics is more problematic a phenomenon than a politicization of science. And that's where I will, yes, so I'll stop there. Those were my three insights. And I think we still have an opportunity to later talk about more recent research in this area. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. And we will finish with Corinne, professor at the Institute for Future Studies and previous member of the Swedish Climate Policy Council. And your research revolves the democratic legitimacy of global environmental politics, non-state actors in climate change governance, and the role of public-public partnerships. In 2010, before the COVID, you have edited Environmental Politics and Deliberative Democracy, examining the promise of new modes of governance. Were the promises kept?
Thank you very much, Bernard, for this very nice introduction. And I just say it's lovely to be here meeting you all in real life at such a beautiful day. So I will actually make my reflections from the 4 questions. My first question, how science is being fed into decision-making at various levels, local, national, regional, and global. This concerns, of course, the classical science policy interface or the gap between science policy. And I don't usually quote Margaret Thatcher, but I will do now. She said, scientists advise and governments decide, which I think is the core of the challenge. And as a reflection here, I sat 4 years as members of the Swedish Climate Policy Council, which is set up like the UK Climate Commission, set up to independently assess the government's progress toward the goal of being climate neutral 2045. Now, we did 4 reports with numerous recommendations, and the government, of course, ignore most. So governments have the power to ignore comments and also exploit scientific uncertainties. And this, then I'm talking about Sweden, which is an advanced green state. But of course, this is a challenge when it comes to global science advice, such as Artie pointed out in IPCC, where the parties in COP basically choose to block or ignore findings of science. Now, how social science, there are many theories, I won't have time to go through theories of social science, that how input is fed into decision making. We have, of course, the rationalist theories that saying it's a linear, speaking truth to science should speak truth to power and be value free and neutral, and science should keep distance and not compromise its integrity. The other idiom is a more constructivist, that science doesn't speak for itself. As Artie said, it's contested. It has to be framed to policymakers to convince them. So work on STS, constructivism, the epistemic community approach, they all show that it's the framing of science, and scientists have to reduce uncertainties for decision making. So that is a challenge. And I think that is the reason why I believe in the second interpretation more, because it's a very contested process. Now, moving to transparency. I actually interpret this dimension. There are two dimensions of transparency. First, I think science is so important in tracking government's progress toward targets, be it decarbonization or sustainability, the 2030 agenda, and to identify when governments fail and not live up to decisions. So transparency is a means, as several of you have worked on, Artie, also to hold governments accountable for the decisions. And it's in the end for democracy an important tool for citizens to see where governments fail. The second dimension of transparency is, of course, science in itself. In science, we have our process peer review, and also, but it's important that science, to maintain its legitimacy and credibility, is open and give, of course, the democratic public's access to its findings, and that it's self-corrected and representative. And we will come back to the issue of democratizing science that Artie also pointed to, and James, that actually avoid the north-south gap in science, gender balance, and also incorporate indigenous and local knowledge. Third question, if I have some time left. So responsibility for decision-making at different levels in terms of using science. Here we are back to the first question, namely, it is the power of the politicians to decide. They can ignore scientific input. It's very frustrating at all levels. So the dilemma is science is only one input for elected politicians to take into account. They need to get the support from the voters. And here, and this concerns the theme of long-term transition or transformation, to get support for very radical, far-reaching, deep decarbonization, you need support from the public. So politicians need to enforce strict climate policy. They need to address the winners and losers of climate transformation, be it citizens or certain industries. So that is the challenge. And now, as James pointed out, we have a problem with authoritarian populism, climate denialism, where even nationalist leaders reach the highest office. And that is a big challenge. Now, moving to the fourth question, very important. How responsive each level to make transition fair? I think this is the million-dollar question. We can see that here we have more hope at the local, at the national and the EU level, where at the EU, for instance, in the Green Deal, the EU has more teeth to hold governments accountable for not taking decisions in line with science. And also we have a number of growing national Science Advisory Council in the world and in Europe. And now we even have an EU advisory board on science that is going to track the progress of the EU members' progress toward the EU law. But then how to make this transition fair? And now I'm coming back to the power of the decision makers.
Perhaps you come back afterwards?
Yes, I can come
you.
back to that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry for taking time.
No, it's okay. It's okay. That's part of the game. So I will answer from my level, but with mini publics, hybrid mini publics with a different implicit deliberative system. It depends how you consider mini publics, because they can be labs, they can be political theaters, or they can be mini deliberative systems. So regarding my past 3 years immersion as embedded philosophers have said, they are coming from the local with, for example, the Great Debate National, where you have this 10,000 local debates, and you had around 70 people. Sometimes you have 40, and you can reach 400. So I've never seen this kind of things. But the difficulty is to match that altogether. It has not been done. It can be on the national level with the French Citizen Convention for the Climate. It is 150 people, member of the convention, and with big power, because the president said, I will transmit without any filter. There is a big question around this. Your 146 proposal to the parliament, and he has done that, but it's okay. We can return afterwards on this. And it can be the European level with the Conference for the Future of Europe, 1 year work with 800 citizens, and after a combination in plenaries with citizens and deputies from the parliament, from the national parliament, you have ministers, you have commissioner from the European Union. It's a very big experiment, interesting, and okay, first attempt, we can say. And behind that, you had the parliament, you have the European Commission, and you have the council. So it's a very, no, it's not like Emmanuel Macron who promised things. It's very difficult to organize these kind of things. And you have a media level, for example, I don't know if you heard about this regional, in Occitanie, they have organized, it's a very big region, it's bigger than Belgium, for example, in terms of space. They have organized a citizen convention on the Green Deal. To answer to the question, first question, depend of the question. Often descriptive predictive sciences, we have to combine this descriptive predictive sciences, climate science, for example, with normative sciences. And it was one of the weaknesses of the French Citizen Convention. They have to answer to the question, how is it possible to decrease 30% of the GES until 2030 in a spirit of social justice? This is the question. It's a normative question. And on 17 months, they have spent 42 minutes to discuss about this big and difficult question and issues. And for example, with the Occitanie Citizen Conference, I've been embedded in this, and I can offer some proposal. The mandate was a very common one from the president of the region. She said, can you make concrete proposals? The politicians, they want concrete. I don't know what is a concrete proposal when you have to deal with justice. Concrete proposal in a spirit of social justice. And I've tried to say to the citizen involved, when you propose something, explain and justify why it's just. It seems obvious for you, perhaps, for me, but for most of them, it's a very difficult question. So the science, it depends what you expect from the experts. For example, in the Conference on the Future of Europe, the experts are there only for 15 minutes. It's a kind of cinema. But in the French Convention, they had a committee of legal experts, and they have provisioned the general recommendation with quasi-law. It was behind a kind of dream of a part of the steering committee who want to have a kind of referendum with only 10 measures, but it has not been followed by the citizen. How transparent and accountable are these science for decision processes in the case of many publics? I think there we have to recognize the controversies, and we have to go deep with the controversies. Why do you propose and to say that this is the best way? For example, in the CCC, they had experts in economy of climate, but they were very, very green. And okay, we have many tools, but it was not discussed at all. And as I've said before, with the justice question, they had no input on this. Not to say what to think, but to know what are the different options. And we have a lot of experts involved in this kind of thing. It depends if you speak about the expert in the institutional design, deliberativist, we need deliberativists to help them. Is it the expert on the rest, the thing we are speaking, the content? For example, it can be, you know, a kind of fiscal tool. And what is the role of, in this conference, we have always fact checkers. I know that fact checkers are important, but if we have fact checkers and somebody can answer to the question very easily, we don't need to use this huge thing. It's because we have controversies. And to finish with this, I think with the question of responsibilities, it's very important to, first of all, these mini publics, they are never accountable. They can say what they want, but at the end, there is no vote, there is nothing. So it's a good news, perhaps they can be very courageous. But if they are very courageous, the problem is not to make proposal, is to make them feasible. And this is what is politics. So I think before to do this kind of things, and we can have at least 12 different goals, we have to see, do we want to educate these people, like in the French case? And after 17 months, they say, you know, we are very well educated on this point of thing. We don't want to go through referendum because the French people, they have not been educated and they will reject our proposal. But so this is an important question. Every institution has a specific authority and responsibilities, and the citizen involved can be there, okay, to be educated, but on the contrary, they can be very interesting because if they are not manipulated, we understand perhaps better why they disagree, what they think, and to finish, how people address their questions. If you are a biologist or an economist or a philosopher, you have different ways to address the question. But when you are an ordinary citizen, you have your own ways, and we have many ways to address the question. And I think deliberation can help you, because if you return back to Aristotle, you will find that the circumstances, the way to describe the context you are involved in is directly connected with this way to ask and to frame the questions. So now we have the second round. Karin, can you in 1 minute, it's much more difficult because 5 minutes was already something difficult, record. What are the central challenges facing a responsive deliberative system? And this system has to be a deliberative or democratic deliberative system, or the ESG governance models, if you have models. I know that you had already this discussion before. And after that, we will continue with the other question. Karin, please.
Yes, thank you. 1 minute. So I actually think one step before deliberation is participation. And we have a large participation gap at various levels, local, national, regional, global. So we cannot deliberate if we don't have the participation of societal stakeholders and communities. And I think in my own country, taking an example from that, we have a very corporativistic system with state-industry relation, very strong interest. We have another example of a problem with deliberation. We have indigenous people, Sami, they have their own parliament, but the power of the parliament is very limited. They can deliberate, but they have limited power, and the Swedish state has historically pursued a very colonialist expansion. So there is challenges. Ideally, it would be wonderful to have that deliberative system you pointed out, but then we have to ensure reducing the participation gap. Thank you.
Thank you. And James, what do you think about this question?
Thanks, Bernard. Well, I guess I would take it at a little bit of a broader level. So I very much like responsiveness as a frame, as your project is focusing on and sort of we're gathering around that topic. And the reason why I like that is because it focuses our attention on the dynamics of governance in changing circumstances. So I think it sort of prompts us to think about responsiveness and how it's realized in a whole range of different ways that might be more or less formal or at different levels, etc. And I guess from that perspective, thinking about responsiveness in the face of strong contestation is especially needed. And that's where my interests would particularly lie. So for me, one of the real central challenges is how we should think about strong contestation to ambitious policy. What might we learn from pushback? And when and how can deliberation help to navigate blockages, and what other forms of thinking might be needed as well, other approaches and techniques.
Thank you, and Archie, on the same question.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Let me answer this by highlighting that for me, a central challenge for responsive governance at a global scale in areas of anticipatory governance is how to counter the technicalization of politics that I was talking about earlier. So for example, I've highlighted this in my own work by drawing attention to the phenomenon of de facto or informal governance by experts of hugely contested anticipatory governance challenges, such as, for example, whether to undertake planetary scale interventions to manipulate incoming levels of sunlight to address climate change. And here the de facto governance can occur through expert assessments, where, for example, contested risks and benefits are framed in certain ways, and that shapes the governance landscape to come. So from my perspective, a key challenge for responsive governance then becomes how to secure accountability of such emerging de facto forms of multi-scale governance by experts. And eventually, I think this is linked to a broader question about responsibility. Where does responsibility in a responsive system rest to ensure a just transition? So for me, in fact, the core notion is not even responsiveness, it is responsibility. Where the greatest responsibility to act rests in securing a just ecological transition, how to ensure the exercise of this responsibility, and how science and knowledge can feed into this.
Thank you, and James, for the sixth question, how can make room for interdisciplinarity, epistemic and normative pluralisms? So pluralisms on science science, normative science, for example, the controversies on justice understanding in areas of scientific controversy, please.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question because it speaks to how we understand the dynamics of ecological transitions and the implications for what forms of policy action we pursue at a particular moment. And I guess something that's on my mind is how we might need to be a little flexible in our thinking about forms of policy action, and the sort of knowledge and norms involved in any specific action taken at a moment in time. It's hard because on the one hand, as scholars, we need to be firm and committed to ecological transitions and trying to advance them. But on the other hand, society is pretty diverse and there's a lot of different views flying around. And so we might need to be flexible in the way that we think about trying to advance change. And so I think this might mean that solutions are not necessarily optimal at a given moment, but perhaps we can think about ways that move society forward in the way that is perhaps needed at a given moment in time, even if that's not ideal. And so it makes me think about what kinds of new and creative ways we can think about action for ecological transitions, engaging with social heterogeneity. So rather than trying to think or assume that everyone can think in the same way, what can we flip that around and start with the mess and work from there? And what might that look like?
Archie?
Thank you very much. Yes, so if the question is how to make room for interdisciplinarity, I think, of course, we must make room for interdisciplinarity, but the challenge, as you've also outlined in your question, Bernard, is well understood that we have to be cognizant that interdisciplinarity is exercised in an unequal context. Not all knowledge is equal, and certain dominant disciplines and perspectives occupy a privileged position. So there's a dire need, in my view, for empirical research about this, whose epistemic and interlinked normative commitments are actually being realized through
It works.
through whose type of responsive governance. And I think that's what we need to shed empirical light on. And more broadly, I would just want to put on the table the question of whether there should be a limit to the search for ever better and ever more fine-grained data and knowledge in order to facilitate a fair ecological transition. So coming back to the point about responsibility to act, is the key political challenge facing a fair ecological transition that we do not know enough? Arguably not. We know enough about who needs to act to take what urgent action in most areas of environmental governance. That's another aspect of justice, in my view. Let's act based on what we already know.
Thank you very much. And to finish, Parain.
Thank you. So this is a very important question. I mean, the climate challenge and a sustainability challenge, it's a post-normal issue area, large decision stakes, high uncertainty, urgent time. So there is this case for epistemic pluralism, both to increase different disciplines and actors, the scale and speed of these challenges, and they are interconnected: health, biodiversity crisis, energy security, war, climate. We need different disciplines. Now, the natural and engineering are dominating, but we need, it's both the technical, institutional, economic, and normative transformation. For instance, in Sweden, we are very engineering society. We stress transformation in terms of fossil-free steel, the technical, but very much less so the behavioral. How can we change our norms and behavior? And so, and on the second, to finish up with the second dimension, we need more pluralism in disciplines, but also, as Artie and James alluded to, democratizing science, including lay, indigenous, and local knowledge. And to end with an example from my own country, the fishers and the fisheries associations, the local fishers, were the first who observed the effects of acid rain. That in the late 1960s, that kicked off the whole science on acidification, and which preceded the Stockholm 72 conference. So we need a democratization of science. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And not to summarize, but to finish this first part. First of all, I thought that we can have some disagreements, because this is a starting point to deliberate. If we don't disagree, we have nothing to deliberate. I have not got a lot of disagreement, but it will come from the audience, hopefully. A contribution to the two questions from my side very quickly. The problem is that perhaps we have no system. We have, you've spoken about the mess, James. I think it's a good starting point. We can say we have sometimes very chaotic interactions. We have people who say that they are against the system. It means they are against the elite, but we need system because we are in very complex society, and it's a complex thing, the transition. But okay, with the deliberative system, as you are familiar with this, it's a bit rough. It's a good starting point, but it is an hesitation between social deliberation, the system. But if it's a real system, you need specific functions, specific responsibilities, and sometimes it's not clear at all, especially from the many public sides. And you have to go beyond the three spheres: science, ethics, and politics, as it is presented in the manifesto of the deliberative system. You have to enter. What do you do when you have the pluralism of moral theories. How is it possible to tackle this problem? And another thing is perhaps we have to think about subsidiarity, not only in terms of the relevant level to decide, as it is very common, at least on a European level, but subsidiarities between the different science that you can convene to answer to the questions. And for question 6, there is a big room, much more bigger than this room, with deliberation. But let's deliberate and not only politely discuss. Take seriously the controversies, face the fact of moral pluralism. There is a big, for example, there is a big disagreement between Rawls and Habermas on this point, and many people think that it was written, for example, the handbook, Oxford Handbook of Deliberative Democracy. These are the two towers. I'm sorry, the two towers are not twin towers. We have to and for them there is a system, and it's impossible to deliberate with different individuals. It's a conjecture for Rawls, and it is a fiction for Habermas. We have to take that seriously, and we have to move beyond them because they say it's impossible. And we have to return to the way, I've said before, the framing of the different questions inside the different sciences. And when you have to offer science for heterogeneous public, you will have to take seriously the questions of these publics. So now we open the floor. We can start with 4 first questions, critiques, or proposal on what you've heard. Please come here. It will be very good because it's the siesta time, and you can address your question from there because we are very poor. We have only one mic. Who wants to address a question? Perhaps you will be afraid to come here in front of, but don't worry. No question, no comment. So we save time. Thank you very much. It's a good place for you?
Yes.
Oh, good. Please. And introduce yourself, because it's important to know who you are.
I'm Joyita Gupta, University of Amsterdam. My question is a little provocative because I've been asked to be provocative. And I have actually 2 parts to it. The first part is, if we are to solve climate change, and if Europe and North America wants to do it democratically, and nobody here wants to sacrifice their lives, whether they're the rich elite or they're the middle class or they're people like us who are teachers, then do we just say it doesn't matter? Justice doesn't matter in a global sense, because then global justice becomes subject to democracies in the global north. That's my first question. And the second question is perhaps even worse. If we allow for multiple understandings of justice, does that undermine the very project of justice? Because are we then fighting amongst each other about what justice is? And therefore we cannot actually come together to say, this is what we want as justice, and this is what we want to achieve.
Thank you. It's possible to ask 2 questions in 1 minute. So somebody else? Yes, please come. Time is not money, time is time, but...
My name is Johan. I'm a PhD student in public policy. What are we going to do about white supremacists? White supremacists.
5 seconds for 1 question. Who can be better? No. Another, we have time. Other questions? It's because you are lazy, you don't want to come here. So, a first round in 1 minute each. We can start with you, James.
I guess I'll just stand here. I don't know how to answer your question, Joyita. I think they're great questions. Maybe I'll just take it. Yeah, take it. That's much more comfortable. Yeah, so your first question, will global justice end up becoming dependent on actions or non-actions of people in the North? Yeah, I mean, I don't work on justice, but I would say that's certainly part of my motivation in my current work. I focus on OECD countries for that reason, in the sense of what I would say is a particular responsibility to change first, and show how that can be done. And so then for me, that raises questions about why action might fail. And that's completely motivated by trying to sort of change those conditions so that global justice does not end up in the way that you mentioned. I don't think I can speak to the issue of single or diverging views on justice. I find that I'm just not knowledgeable enough to say that. I guess what I would say is something I work with legitimacy, not justice. And I'm particularly taken, I think, in the last year or so by sociological views on legitimacy versus normative ones, in the sense of where, if we think about legitimacy as being defined external to a political community, and then as analysts, we sort of analyze that and say, well, it falls short in various ways, or do we understand legitimacy as something that is generated within a political community itself? So I think Amartya Sen, I'm going out on a limb here, but Amartya Sen's book, The Idea of Justice, leans towards a more endogenous or internal notion of justice and how that is produced within a political community and therefore might evolve over time. Yeah, what that means for a single or a diverging view, I don't know, except that trying to all work towards a single view of anything, I don't know, maybe that's hard as well.
Thank you. Karin?
Thank you, Joita. Two very good questions. I think for that reason, exactly in the north, I mean, you are right, the democracies are in the north are holding global south hostage because we don't want to transform, and how to make fast, deep decarbonization legitimate is a key. And here, which I said in my talk also, that we need to address governments the distributional consequences of climate change in rich advanced industrial countries, compensation for the winners and the losers, to build public legitimacy for these large-scale transformation. That's the only route, since I believe that democracy is the best way to, of all other options, to tackle transformation. And yeah, I have to think about the multiple definition of justice. I mean, it's justice within countries, justice between generations, as Fridays for Future has shown. We need to, yes, there are competing understanding, but we need to have a full sense of it. And for white supremacists, neo-Nazis and others, there is the level you cannot engage in deliberation. It's a criminal act and it's an offense to people. And I can just as a comment say that I'm very sad for my own government that has been formed just last week in a coalition with a party that has neo-Nazis roots. Very, very discomforting. And we see already on climate the rollback on legislation. Thank you.
And RT, perhaps to finish, other questions?
Okay.
You're shy.
Thank you. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, I think that's an important point you raised, Joita, about different conceptions of justice and are we fighting each other and therefore all going down together. And I think, well, just to say that there can be no effective planetary stewardship without planetary justice is sort of the point of departure. And of course, that raises all kinds of questions about what is then planetary justice. But at least what we've tried to do in the context of giving some meat to this notion is to say one way to understand planetary justice is to prioritize the poorest wherever they live. So we have a short perspective piece saying that, well, you know, that's one understanding of justice. But I think you point to an important risk as well of getting into academic debates about different notions of justice and then tying ourselves in knots. because of course, united we stand and divided we fall. And I think the key issue here is we can't fall into that trap. So of course, notions of justice will vary by issue and by context. I think Karen talked about intergenerational and other forms of justice. And I think my simple point would be that we need to push for different manifestations of what is just wherever possible. And while doing so, as academics interested in just outcomes, we also need to continually make our own normative position clear, where we are coming from, what we stand for, what are the normative assumptions underpinning our sort of academic proposals. So that's my best effort. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions in the, you are not the audience, huh? You are not passive normally. You can, so to finish on this point, before to take your proposal, but if you have no proposal, we will save 18 minutes. That's very good. No, this question of justice, it's not to make a philosophical, exercise and to say, okay, we will discuss and we will have the same framework and we can continue to work afterwards. But just take an example with the French Citizen Convention for the Climate. The main point was to make the transition in a spirit of social justice. For most of the members of the convention, they thought that they know what is social justice, because they have no way to be more explicit or to have to detail different kind of choice in terms of taxation, in terms of carbon tax. They have avoided the carbon tax, by the way. It's really interesting. It was the main problem with the yellow vest, and it has been disappeared. They have said, we don't want to speak about this tax. Don't manipulate it. It's not our responsibility, it's yours. But it's not to say that, but to open this black box. Just to give you an anecdote, not from the Citizen Convention for the Climate, but the Occitanie Citizen Conference on the Green Deal. When we have asked them, when you make a proposal, make the link between justice, why this concrete proposal is just. And I've said to you, it was very difficult for them to answer. It's a bit like, they say, it's just because it's just, because I think it's just. But to require justification for them, it's a big, it's difficult for most of the people. They are monists. They think that their moral and ethical assumptions is true. And when they are confronted with disagreement or people who do not think as they think, they are a bit uncomfortable. But you can understand. You choose them by sortition. They don't know the other people, and they have to tackle very sensitive issues where the disagreement is very hard, ethical, justice, and all these kind of things. So I return to the Occitanie, and I've said to them, okay, it's very difficult to make the connections between a proposal, a recommendation, and the justification in terms of justice. But we'll make a vote. Do you think that in your society, everybody has the same conception of social justice? And they have raised the hand to say, no, we disagree on this point of view. And I say, okay, we are living in a political country. We know that we have a left wing, we have a right wing. We can make different choices with different combinations in terms of intergeneration, in terms of the tools you use. Do you want to make new law? Do you want to be much more economical incentive or things like that? So I think it's not a kind of luxus to say, okay, it's only a question of for philosopher. At least for 1 or 2 sessions, help them to see that we have different way to justify the different choice we disagree on. So it's a contribution. And now we can go to, so it's the place where we are. But yes, I want to have, yeah, this one. do you have other contributions, only proposal to answer to the same easy questions? And if you have proposal, feel free, you come here and you say things we have not said to answer to these 4 questions. Yes, Jonathan, please. And okay, we say that we are to be more inclusive. It's the reason that you can come here. Please, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thanks to our speakers for today. I'm Jonathan Pickering from University of Canberra, and I just wanted to, well, I'm not sure if it's exactly address any of the questions in particular, but it relates to a point that Artie made about the technicalization of politics. And I suppose that then relates to, say, our role as social scientists as well. And particularly, say, social scientists working on questions of politics. There is, of course, consider ourselves as experts in the area, and having a positive contribution to make to public debate. But it does seem that, say, there is often a perception that social scientists mainly have opinions to offer rather than sort of expertise of the kinds that natural scientists might be able to offer. So I suppose my question there is about, well, how could social scientists more productively contribute to this deliberative system? I mean, should it be more in the vein of styling themselves as experts in the vein of natural scientists, or more specifically embracing their role as political actors, or is it maybe both?
It's a question, or you have a proposal on this point to offer to us?
Well, so that was the question. I can offer a proposal as well, if you like. But oh, okay, sure, thank you. Well, I suppose this is just about the question of, say, the involvement of social scientists in, say, science policy processes like the IPCC and so on. And, well, of course, you've had, say, philosophers involved in various IPCC assessments, including attempting to clarify some issues around meanings of justice, right? The 5th assessment report and so on. Now, we could say this is a problematic issue, because ultimately what justice means is a fundamentally political issue. But I guess I would argue that, say, philosophers, normative theorists and others still have a positive contribution to make, maybe in some of the conceptual clarification, without overstepping their role, and acknowledging, of course, the limitations of their own expertise, and that ultimately questions of what is just in a particular situation need to be decided by people citizens in a democratic sense. So the proposal would be greater involvement of social scientists in science policy processes, but with an appropriate understanding of the limitations of their role in a democratic process.
Yeah, and to make it a bit more sophisticated, we have the difficult combination between social or political sciences and the normative sciences, legal, moral philosophy, or normative economy. It's a bit orthogonal, and it's difficult for a sociologist to find a place there. It's true. Please come and introduce yourself. And if it's not for this 4 first, because we have to move a bit, you can answer to this 2. Please, feel free to choose.
All right. Hi, I'm Andréane Doyon, or Andréane Doyon. I'm at Simon Fraser University. Something that has not really come up that I was hoping or thought should So I don't know if it's a proposal, but if you want me to ask a question, then offer my own proposal, I'll do so. But we haven't talked about money. So when I read how science is being fed into decision-making and what disciplines, what kind of science is getting funded is important. Number two, how transparent and accountable all these sciences, that ties back into where the money comes from. So what's being funded and by whom really matters when we think about what science we're incorporating and listening to and using, and whose voices are getting heard, whose research is getting funded, from where, and on what topics. What are the responsibilities for the level of decision-making we're focused on in terms of doing something with that scientific input? Are we thinking about responsibilities and transparencies and accountability in terms of how that research is done? And again, where that money comes from and things like that. And then the responsiveness, is there money to respond? We might know things, but can we actually do the right thing, or can we do the best thing if we don't have the money to do it? I know this happens a lot when it comes to thinking about climate justice and environmental justice, and thinking about implications of more equitable outcomes when it comes to a lot of things, particularly at the local levels where I work as well. But talking to folks, they say, we know these sorts of interventions would have impact here. We don't have the money to do it, but we do have the money to do it here. So money becomes a really, really important part of all of these questions.
Thank you. And I've seen another hand raised. Yes, please come. And introduce yourself. It can be for this.
Hi, thank you. My name is Tobias Müller from the New Institute and the University of Cambridge. Really kind of related to what you were talking about in terms of money. So one of the things that Habermas warned is the colonization of the life world and of the discursive sphere. And I really wonder, isn't also a question who owns the discursive spheres? Like if the richest man on the planet can basically buy part of this of the public sphere, and a lot of the public debates are done on social media. So I wonder, while we're talking about kind of nice little mini publics and small experiments in deliberative democracy, what's actually happening in the background is that there's an incredibly centralization of knowledge production and a privatization also of public discourse. So my question would be to you, like, given the incredibly power of in private companies, of Facebook, of Google, of Twitter, and so on, to steer and limit and shape public deliberation, what does it mean for deliberation? And maybe the proposal would be, wouldn't it be necessary for us to control, or have a collective control over those key means of public deliberation? So yeah, collectivize Twitter maybe as a proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps a last proposal. So, responsive speakers. Take your time. Or perhaps, yeah, it's good to run. We have no time with the transition.
Sure. Hi, my name is Eric Galbraith at McGill University. And I would like to propose thinking as broadly as possible about what democracy is actually, and how it could possibly function in the 21st century. Because, you know, I feel like a lot of the discussion seems to focus on the way that democracy is done and how it can be tweaked. But a lot of our democracies were actually constructed a long time ago. Here in Canada, it was constructed in the late 19th century at a time when it was necessary to travel on horseback in order to represent your people at the central government in distant Ottawa. And I would love to see more discussion of the fundamental basis of what needs to happen in order to have these different components, the scientific understanding, the ethical agreements, you know, how ideas about justice could possibly be formed at the global scale, imagining how it might work outside of the current systems and ways that things are done. I would love to know if there's more that anybody could comment on where those discussions might be taking place or how they could happen faster.
Thank you. We have finished with the audience. So in 2 minutes, what have you learned? Nothing. That's good. What are your reactions regarding these proposals? Perhaps you have no.
Thank you. All very good questions and proposal. I will try to weave them together here. I think actually with Jonathan's point, very important point on the role of social science. I totally agree on that. After many years in research, social science have been used as the so-called end of pipe. They bring us in to discuss policy advice in large projects, not to diagnose the problem. However, I must say, and I'll talk about the Swedish context, that has changed. And I think now social science is more forefronted in research, and also coming to research funding, because the scale of change that is needed, it's not only technical transformation, it's not economic, it's about changing behavior and consumptions. And I see now, and I'm talking about the Swedish finance system, a changing where humanities, behavior science, actually there has been deliberate attempts to bring in more social science. So I totally agree on that, but it might not happen in all spaces. And that links to the questions on funding. Yes, of course, funding is extremely central. And I know in my country has a large funding on climate and environment, but in many countries that is cut down. Now, totally the point on how social media shapes public opinion and defines the public sphere, I totally agree on that. I don't have a solution here in 15 seconds. The final question, yes, we need democratic visioning, but I must say, since we have a big democratic backlash and an autocratization right now, I somehow, of the old party-based democracy, the democracy is under pressure already, and maybe that's why we need to think new forms of deepened democracy at various levels. But right now, I think it's about, in some countries, saving democracy from the pressure of populism, nationalism, and autocracy. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, Arti? Comments, and perhaps what have you learned?
Well,
And
thank
perhaps
you.
you've changed your mind on some point.
Yeah, no, I think, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think those were excellent questions, and very grateful for the audience to engage in this manner. I think going back to Joita's question, that was an important one about contested notions of justice. So I think that's something to continue to think about in relation to contested notions of science and contested norms and how all those intersect. But then coming to the next round of questions, I think Jonathan's points are also very important. So, well, what is the role for social scientists? And if you talk about a technicalization of politics, I think also in terms of the proposal, Jonathan, that as far as I understood it, you were talking about, well, should social scientists, is it also sort of embedded in certain, analytical positions? Are we just, should we acknowledge that we are political actors? And I would say that, of course, everyone, social, natural scientists, all sorts of expertise is coming from a given political position. And so I think that's imperative for everyone to acknowledge that they are political actors, but then also that that's not all that social science provides, of course. And so our analysis has to be grounded in, so for example, as governance scholars, and we face this challenge in addressing sort of being scholar activists and taking on certain challenges, say with the climate engineering issue that I'm now involved with, about how to bring a political position over which is grounded in an analytical understanding of, say, how governance architectures have been designed and might work in a way that would not further a fair and effective sort of, for example, deployment of controversial planetary scale interventions like climate engineering. So that position is grounded in analytical research on governance architectures, but it is, of course, a political and normative position. So I would say some sort of combination of that, and then take the point that one should exercise humility and acknowledge the limitations of one's role as a social scientist in these processes. But then I would say, of course, that humility has to extend to, across the sciences, social and natural scientists. I think the point about money is of course, right on and exactly on the money, so to say. But, and that's of course been long-standing discussions about, whose science, how science agendas are shaped by who's funding it, and right close to home at our university campuses as well, where, there might be private sector collaborations and a co-funding of research and science. So I think those are crucial issues, of course. And then just coming to the point about centralization of knowledge infrastructures, etc. I think that those are some of the most cutting edge important discussions around these issues, of course. And it's not just centralization, but also concurrent commodification and financialization of these knowledge infrastructures and big data in general. So this idea that data is the new oil, and of course, that raises the question, should we celebrate that or be concerned about that? And that's something that I'm very much interested in looking at as well. I was just in a panel on Earth space sustainability governance earlier this morning, where it's all about generating, it's about radical transparency and generating reams and reams of real-time data about all sorts of environmental phenomena. And the assumption underlying this is that a step change in this kind of radical transparency is also a step change in politics, that having this kind of information will facilitate the kind of action that we haven't been able to take so far. And I think that's to be questioned, of course. Is such a step change in knowledge and transparency really a step change in politics? And who owns and who has access to that kind of big data generation? Those are crucial questions.
Thank you. And James?
Thanks, Bernard, and thanks everyone for your questions. And I just wish we had more time to discuss these issues. For me, I think where I began was trying to sort of hone in on the issue of conflict, or the role of conflict in ecological transitions. And I still see that as really central, at least where I'm at in my thinking now, and sort of trying to understand where that comes from, but also then how you might think about working with or through conflict. And so I guess the three things that come out for me from the session are conflict, legitimacy, what does it mean? How can legitimate action be generated? But I think also a deeper issue about the conditions of possibility for radical action, or at least ambitious action, comes up, especially in some of the questions about money, the privatization of public discourse, the white supremacy question, and the question of or provocation about more fundamentally rethinking democracy, notions of democracy itself. Yeah, so I guess it makes me think about, do we still, or makes me wonder, do we still think about sustainability governance in somewhat tame ways? Are we a little bit too nice, or we think that things are a little bit too nice? When behind the scenes, behind the curtains, or underneath the surface, you don't have to scratch the surface to sort of get to these more really difficult forces that sort of create or limit conditions of possibility. But then I think flipping that around, and I guess this comes to Jonathan's intervention around the role of social science, it makes me, I always try to think, okay, so we can highlight conflict and we can highlight these challenges, but what then are our policy prescriptions? What are we proposing that we should do differently? And so I think trying to keep that tension, those two things in tension, is really important. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And you want to add something for the point six, perhaps the priorities to work on in this community, if it's a relevant question. And the other one, why is it really important to tackle these questions from an interdisciplinary point of view? We can have just juxtaposition of different disciplines in silos, and it works very well. It's not messy. Why do we really need this perspective? It can be arty to change a bit, or yeah.
Thank you, Bernard. Which question am I?
This two one. If you want to add something, it's not compulsory, you know, mandatory.
Okay. No, I guess
We are
you're
free
asking-
here.
Thank you. So what would I prioritize in my own work?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
it's
I think-
less, it's easier
right.
if it's for you only.
I think, well, what I plan to prioritize and work on in terms of key challenges to accelerate fair ecological transitions in the terminology of this semi-plenary, I think the short answer would be the justice angle. And of course, we already touched on what does justice and equity actually mean in the face of pluralist understandings and things of that nature. But that's the overarching concern. And more specifically, I would then be I am interested in unpacking how contested norms and contested science are intertwined in areas of anticipatory governance, and how this is then related to architectures of governance. So I'm a particular fan of multilateralism and state-based governance. So I'm unapologetically in that camp. But I think for all of us, regardless, governance scholars, regardless of which camp we might be in, what architectures of governance are most likely to generate and operationalize, for example, shared norms, but also to ask the question whether we can have effective and fair governance even in the absence of shared norms, because I think that's the challenge facing us. How can we devise governance architectures to facilitate just ecological transitions in the face of persisting political conflict and contested norms? That's what one has to do. So how to do that?
Somebody Karen, perhaps you want to add something?
Yes, I think after this session, I'm even more convinced that a core issue that I'm working on with people here in the room also is how to secure a democratically legitimate transformation. Now, it's a very large-scale transformation, and it's going to be very fast. Usually, large-scale transformation in history occurs through war and revolution, and we don't want that. Well, we want a renewable energy revolution. But the missing link of the public and the citizens, and I think securing democratically legitimate transformation is very linked to justice, addressing the distributional consequences, being upfront that there are winners and losers of this transformation, and overcoming the carbon lock-in. We need to address that and find compensation. So I think we need to bring in the citizen and the policymakers and the linkage between these. The transformation literature has very much been conceptualized as technical or economical, but we need to return the triangle: government, science, and citizens. That has to be balanced. Thank you.
James?
I completely agree with everything Karen said, and that's also what I'm really interested in too. Is the
With everything?
Well, at least the part on the democratically legitimate transformations. So that part, I'm really, yeah, I really agree. I think this is a much broader thought, but as social scientists, I mean, this is a bit sort of pivoting off Jonathan's comment. You know, in addition to sort of, I think, being a critical friend of decision-making in all sorts of ways, I think that's one of our key value propositions as social scientists, is to help think along. I think we also should be bold in trying to create new ideas that inspire people. I think I really think that ideas can change the world. And we see that in all sorts of ways with, let's not go into that, but I think we should try it. I think we should create, rethink political economic paradigms, rethink how society could be, and sort of be bold in that as well. So sort of I guess I'm always, again, this is the tension that I think we always need to try to occupy, which is the supporting pragmatic action, but also, the big ideas and thinking ahead and trying to sort of animate, create new ideas about what could be possible and how we could realize that.
Thank you. And perhaps to finish, not to conclude, regarding the question of funding, I'm part of a European project around the question of where can we let ordinary citizens participate in the science processes upstream till the end. And the partners are national funder for science. And the main question is how ethically we can organize this kind of participation. It's now we participate, we want to participate ethically, but I've tried to let them to think the reverse. What can be the contribution on the ethical side from the ordinary citizen in this kind of things? Both have to be taken into account. Only to say that the question of money and participation can be, are already there. Regarding the question of to change your mind, I didn't want that we have this great national debate, because I know that already for the theoretical side, we have many problems to tackle. But okay, Macron has proposed this kind of things. And we have the citizen convention after the Grand Débat National. And during the Grand Débat National, we have sent inquiries. And in my team, they are quantitative sociologists. They have their ways to work, but they have their questions too. But we have convinced them to put some question around deliberative democracy. And I know that it's very difficult, but one of the questions was, during this debate, you have been attended, what was the main question, the main problem, and did you change your mind during this discussion? Because if you don't change your mind, it's useless to deliberate. This is part of one of the theory. And our colleague said, yeah, it's important, you can address the question, but not forget that another item of answer, I have no idea, no opinion. And it's really interesting because a lot of people have no opinion on this, but they attended the debate. 80% of the people don't change their mind. And if you make the connections between the people who change their mind and their jobs, most of the people who are changing their mind are teachers. And okay, I was a bit puzzled, and I've exchanged with people not from the academic spheres, and they've said, yeah, but it's normal. The teachers are the only people who think that they can change you. You start the year, you do the program, and at the end, you have been changed. We are in the OAS. It's a place for the study of education. So I know that it's not the last word. And I think, contrary to Habermas, one of the main problems is not to reach something like a consensus or other ways or agreement. But if you have no dissensus, no disagreement, if you have no space for that, you will already be in an apparent consensus, and there is no need for deliberation. So this is one thing. Another thing is, and I know it's a tricky question for people who are dealing with politics. Do we have to take people as they are, with their bias? I don't know if you know the book Politics for Realists. in the French Convention, they had no philosopher, but they had somebody trained in cognitive science. And she was there to help the people to write the appropriate message, communication, but not in terms of deliberation, argumentation, rational, and all this kind of stuff. Much more, if you want to address new proposal to the people, you have to take into account kind of receipt of kind of requests or things. This is a big question. For philosophers, of course, they will disagree and they will say, return back to the invention of rhetoric. Rhetoric has been invented in a period of time when democracy has become more complex. There is a strong connections between rhetoric and the complexity of a democracy. And with the question to start with the mess, only one anecdote, because a couple of days before we have lost our colleague Bruno Latour. When he was professor in l'École des Mines, school, that's a very important school for engineers. Engineers have to follow one scientific controversies with 3 other colleagues, and they have to present these controversies at the end of the year. And you know, when they started these courses, they were very puzzled. They don't understand what does it mean to follow a scientific controversies, because for them, the society and the world is very rational. We have only small irrational spaces, and the focus of the course was exactly the opposite. We have a lot of irrational places and perhaps sometimes place for rational thing. And I think we can, and I will finish with this, make a connection between that and what Arti has said in the beginning with credibility. Credibility, to be credible, I think it's a very big issue, because there you have a collection of rational, different understanding and emotion, and it's difficult to know what is the part of all these elements when you argue. And to finish with our colleague Aristotle, but he passed a long time ago, in the rhetoric, you have a strong connection between who is speaking, the emotion you use, because it has been invented to persuade the judge in a trial. So it's a very important issue. Thank you very much for having attended this semi-plenary. I think, and I will know that all has been recorded, that your contribution can not only fit, but reframe or help or see what are the difficulties in the responsiveness project. Thank you very much for the people who have helped us with the camera, with the Zoom. Goodbye for the people who are not lucky enough to be in Toronto. It's very hot today. And no, that's a fake news. And we will have a break, and after that, we will open the conference with, you know, we have already the semi-plenary, and after that, you have the plenary. I don't know what will happen just afterwards. Thank you very much.